Hi everybody, this is Mark from We Talk Art. I am testing a bunch of black inks. Started at 24, but it's grown. Tell you why. We are going to look at inks that are in pens. We're going to look at inks that go into fountain pens, and we are going to look at inks that can be used with dip pens, brushes, and airbrushes. So let's roll the intro and get into it. Hopefully not literally. This black ink test idea started during the making of the previous video that I did on pen and ink. I remembered a page that was in an old sketchbook that I had swatched a few black inks that I had around at the time. It was a bit random and it was on crappy paper, so I decided it was time to revisit this with more control, consistency, and I thought I should do it for We Talk Arts because I thought some of you might be interested in this. I started this video a few weeks back prior to going to that big art material trade show. My intention was to do it with about 20 inks, most of which I had, but when I mentioned this to some of the people at the show, I was given even more inks to test. That might have been a mistake, but now we're somewhere around 30 inks, so you can count along at home, see if I'm right on that. I also wanted to test the inks on two different papers. I did a little research which backed up my thoughts. The popular papers for pen and ink was a hot press watercolor paper and a Bristol smooth. I decided I would use the Arches 90-pound hot press watercolor paper in natural white, which is 100% cotton, and then the Strathmore 400 series Bristol smooth paper, which is an alpha cellulose paper wood pulp. Although they are both like for pen and ink, they are very different papers. The hot press is 100% cotton with very little tooth, but some tooth, and it is sized both internally and externally to control how water and liquids are absorbed. That's watercolor paper, and which is true of most watercolor papers. The Bristol is designed for dry media for the most part, and typically doesn't have any sizing, but it has a very smooth surface, smoother than the hot press paper will be. I wanted to have both a cotton and an alpha cellulose based papers because some inks are more waterproof or less waterproof on one or the other, so I wanted to test that. The way I proceeded with this test was to get the two sheets of paper. I made a template that I could then mark out my design for my swatches, and it included a 3x3 inch swatch area, a line so I could write the title, and then mark so that I could make two line marks. So for inks that were in pens, I used the thinnest and the thickest line. For all these dip pen inks, what I did was I used a Zebra G nib and a Browse nib 2mm for the thicker line. For the swatches, I went back and forth whether I would use some kind of nib or a brush, and I recalled that I had this 3/4 inch Speedball nib and decided to use this. Now, Speedball doesn't actually make this nib anymore that I'm aware of, but Browse does if you're interested in getting something like that. This ended up being good for some inks and not good for others. And that's gonna be somewhat of a theme you're gonna see here, is that these inks perform different on different surfaces, which is something I call out a lot. Different nibs work well with others and not others. And so, although I don't know if I could have found a better nib to do these swatches, it didn't always work with all the inks. And so I try to call out where I felt like the nib was failing or what may have caused an ink maybe not to perform at the level I was hoping for. So we're going to talk about that too. As I said earlier, these inks fell into three categories. The first I'm going to cover is inks that would only be good for dip pens, brushes, or something like an airbrush. And then the next category is going to be fountain pen inks like this. It's generally all inks that you can put into a fountain pen. And then the final category is going to be ink in pens. And so those are that. And there's some lessons to be learned from this. I've already pretty much done that test. The things I mainly wanted to look for was how black the ink was, how it worked on the paper, how neutral it was, what the surface quality was, and how waterproof it was. I've been having this little joke in my head that this is the most scientific approach to this that I could come up with. I wanted to have something that would kind of help me verify darkness and so forth. And so my way of doing that was I ended up photographing all the swatches on the two papers together, and then I loaded them in. I used a consistent lighting, I used a consistent exposure, and then I loaded them into Lightroom, which is the photo software that I use. And then I set a black point and white point that I've used for reproducing artwork. And typically this swatch here is something that I printed on an Epson printer that I've always known has had a really good black. The low end here, the 0, I usually set this to 4% black, because usually if you go down to 0, it means you pretty much underexposed your shot. And then I set the white off the scale to about 95% white. And so that gives a great range. And then I verify using exposure that the 50% is just about 50%. So then I photographed all the cards, I loaded them into Lightroom, I did that light calibration, and then I checked each of the swatches to determine its RGB values. Now I put this all into a spreadsheet that I am going to put on my website. There will be a link to it below. You'll be able to link a zip file that will have that spreadsheet and all of these images if you want to dive into these yourself. What I did is I was trying to find a good dark representation, something that wasn't an anomaly dark, but wasn't a place where possibly the opacity didn't work right or the nib didn't work right or something like that. So there was a little bit of hunting and finding the right spot on it. I also did an overexposed image, one shot overexposed, because that brings the black a little bit more into the range of the sensor to get a little bit more difference in the color value. I'm trying to determine how neutral it was. I didn't find that as useful as I hoped for, so I didn't use that a ton. I found that the base numbers were good enough to determine if there was a bias toward warm or cool, and I noted those. So that's basically where this information comes from. So one note before we get into this all is that I thought, and I'm sure you're here looking for me being able to point to one of these and going, this is the best black ink. And that just is not going to happen. I found that ultimately there was way too many variables and too many differences, and different things exceeded in some areas and other areas. And a good example is I was kind of surprised compared to the dip pen and the fountain pen inks that the normal pens just didn't even perform at that level. I'm going to talk about that at the end. But there's pens that I use and I love, and even though they don't perform as good as some of the other inks, I'm choosing the pen possibly over the ink. As I've said in other videos, and you're going to probably hear me say a lot if you follow me, is that the surface you put your products on makes a huge difference, and this is no exception. And it also came out that some of these inks did not perform too well on this hot press paper and this Bristol paper. So there is another consideration that there's other papers. And I'm going to do a quick test at the end, throwing some of my lower performing pens onto a paper that I use a lot, which is a mixed media paper. And that's one that I did not test on. So we're going to kind of look at that as this final thing. The first ink we're going to talk about is Golden's High Flow Carbon Black. Now, this is considered an acrylic paint, but it's also considered an ink, and I have some other inks that I'm doing that have acrylic binders also. This, Golden says this can be used in airbrushes, brushes, pens, and even technical pens. It is very liquid, so it is an ink. They claim that this carbon black is made from carbon that is acquired from burning gas. That's according to their website. It is very pigmented. It came in as the blackest of the inks that I tried across the board on all of them. The downside with this is going to be probably the surface quality. It is very black. It is slightly thicker than some of the other inks I used, and as a result, the larger nib that I used to do the swatch, it didn't perform really well for that. And you can see examples of that here. You can see it as it shines. Wherever it's thicker, it gets more glossy. And in the thinner areas, it has an semi-gloss kind of look to it. This may not appeal to everybody. It worked very well on both papers. So this ink is very black. It actually came in at 2.4 and 2.1%. It's a little darker on the Bristol, and it is actually darker than the swatch that came off my Epson printer, which is says a fair amount for that. It was the darkest one that we tested. Again, the only problem would be with this is going to be the acrylic glossy finish. So it's very black. It's also very neutral. It did not work well with that 3/4 inch nib, although you can add water and thin this out if you're not getting flow. I did not. I used it right out of the bottle. It's very waterproof. I swatched down here is where you're going to want to look at these. That's where I swatched with water, and there's very little evidence I did that. It did work well as far as opacity on both of these papers. Okay, so the next one isn't really an ink. At the trade show, Absolute Black is coming out with this product called Absolute Black. It's basically a paint. In their booth, I kind of thought that they had watered it down, which you can water it down with water. I tried to water it down to the level of ink where I thought it would flow off the nibs that I had, and that kind of failed. It did not work after I watered it down to that level. So I kind of cheated and I used a brush on this. I would not consider this in the range of the other inks. It's just kind of an interesting new product, so I thought I'd put it in. I did the work and tested it, or I would have thrown it out. It is a very matte finish. Their website says it absorbs 99% of the light, and if my tests were accurate, that wasn't quite true, but it still was very, very dark. Overall, I think this is more for paint type applications. It had a very matte finish. You can see just a little bit of sheen off of maybe the thicker areas. One of the sheets did have some bronzing on it that I thought was interesting that you can kind of see there. So this is where I painted it on. That might be a combination of things, maybe a little bit of water or impurities in the water or whatnot. It came in at 2.7 and 2.8%. It was a little darker on the watercolor paper actually. And it's very waterproof. You can just see a slight bit of where I pulled it. Now, as far as the waterproofing on these, I ended up letting these dry at least an hour. Some of them got a lot more than an hour. So there's a handful of them that said they were waterproof after 24 hours. I'm not sure any of these got 24 hours. So take that for what it is. Anyway, you might keep an eye out for Absolute Black when it comes out. Our next ink is another ink that I didn't include in the first one, but when I was in the De La Rowney booth, they hit me up to add this. This is the De La Rowney System 3 Acrylic Ink Black. This is a pigment-based ink, high light fastness, opacity, pretty waterproof. So it also performed pretty well. So it did better on the Bristol at 2.4%. And on the watercolor paper, it was at 3.5%. It's still, both of these are darker than my swatch, which is pretty impressive. It has a slight sheen to it. I felt like it applied very well to both of these papers. You can see that it's very waterproof with just the very faintest of pickup. Some of that could have just come off the brush. It's so faint. When I hold it up, as far as a sheen, you can see that it does have a sheen, but it has a really nice black. If you look into the areas that it is, that the ink overlapped and got a little thicker, it was a little glossier, but it performed very well for the surface quality. Also very neutral, worked well on both papers with very opaque. So this is another one. This is another acrylic-based ink. It'll be like the Golden and the FW, although the surface quality of this, I think, is much better if you're combining it with other inks than the Golden is. So Speedball makes their super black India ink. This is definitely a classic. You'll see it almost everywhere you go to buy India ink. It is waterproof, permanent, fadeless, and contains 100% carbon black pigment. That's off their website. You can see this one has been very well loved and it's almost actually gone. So I've had this a while. I like to note that if these are older inks for some reason that might affect. This ink, for the most part, again, performed very well. It performed better on the Bristol than it did on the hot press watercolor paper. 2.7% on the Bristol and then 4.1%. And you can definitely see on the watercolor paper, there's a little bit less opacity. So the opacity on the Bristol was very good, and the opacity on the hot press is a little less. The surface qualities are both very good, control kind of a slight sheen to a matte or semi-matte finish. You can see here that there is a little bit of pull with the water. I would have expected this to be more waterproof, although it may have been the time that I hit it, or maybe some inks, if it's too heavy, will pull those heavy sections because it doesn't get the opportunity to bind into the paper. But you can see here, it definitely wanted to pull that line that I drew with that G-nib. So there was a little bit of that. It should be more waterproof. I don't know. It is extremely neutral. Only a 0.1 variation in the 3 colors. So this is another, it's a classic. You can buy it in big bottles almost anywhere. It's very affordable. It worked well on these 2 papers for the most part. Definitely better on the Bristol. I should note that for traditional indie ink, that the Speedball is a little thicker than other ones. That's going to give you much easier application with some things, but some people might find it a little thick for their uses. So that would be one thing you might want to test if you're planning on using this indie ink, is how thick it is and how it flows. You can water this down, and a fun thing, as I've shown in another video, you can actually add more and more water, creating a grayscale that you can use. So indie inks are pretty fun for that. Our next ink is going to be the Kuratake Super Black Ink 60. This was designed for the comic book industry. It is a very matte black ink, resists lifting, it's waterproof, and safe to use with alcohol markers, which is not true of all these inks. I did not test for that, but yeah, alcohol markers will pull up some kinds of ink. And as you can see, the swatches, there was a little bit of pull with water here, but overall, it's very opaque. It went down very consistently. It has a nice matte finish to it, and it's fairly neutral, very neutral. Sorry, it's very neutral, very black. It came in at 4.6 on the hot press and 4.9 on the Bristol, which puts it right about at the same blackness as my swatch from the Epson printer. Finish is pretty decent. You can see that it can get a little bit of a sheen to it, but all these inks are going to sheen to some degree. I think this is approaching one of the nicer finishes. And it even worked with that nib okay. So this is a pretty nice ink that you might want to consider from Kuratake. The next ink I have for you is Dr. P.H. Martin's Black Star HICARB ink. This is one that I tested a couple other times, and I like this ink. It's light, fast, permanent, and waterproof once dry. Claims it's a glossy finish with extremely high carbon content. I didn't find it to be terribly glossy, but it's a pretty nice ink. It's kind of funny, when you're looking at these inks, there's ones that kind of stand out for different reasons, and when I swatched this, I really visually thought this was one of the better performers. It is not the Blackest, though. It did work really well with that thick nib, and you'll see that when I hold it up for a kind of a sheen test, you'll see that it's much more consistent, even where it might have doubled up from the pen overlapping. And that's true of pretty much both of these different swatches. But you can see that glossiness they're talking about, but for the most part, it would be, in my opinion, at the most a semi-gloss, and it's definitely looks very nice, it's very consistent, and is definitely a good choice. So it's very black, around 4.7%, very neutral, has a high waterproof. I can barely see a little bit there. That might have been the brush, so it didn't pick up at all with the water. Very opaque on both of the papers. It applied really well, one of the better applying inks. And even though they claim it's glossy, it does have we'll call it a semi-gloss or semi-matte finish that is, in my opinion, pretty appealing. So very nice ink. Our next ink is a classic. They've actually just redesigned this bottle recently. This is the Higgins Black Magic ink. Their material says this ink is considered water resistant when allowed to dry 24 hours. It is deep and rich black using a carbon pigment. This one came in very close again to my Epson swatch at between 4.6 and 4.7%, a little bit better on the Bristol. It is very neutral. It has a high waterproof. You can see it pulled just ever so slightly. I did not wait there 24 hours. Maybe that's why, so your mileage may vary in that. It was very opaque on both papers. I think better on the Bristol than it was on the hot press watercolor paper. And it has very similar to the last ink, very similar to the other ink in that it has a little bit of a semi-gloss to it, but when you're looking at it, it's very low. I think its surface quality was decent, and its characteristics all around were a pretty nice ink. And it typically is something that's readily available. So I put this in because I had it as a Higgins calligraphy ink and black. They say it is a pigment and dye mix, making it water-based ink. And they say it can be used in pens, brushes, airbrushes, and even fountain pens. I had this bottle for a very, very long time, and I almost took it out, but I decided to do a second swatch. The initial swatch didn't work out very well, so I took it and shook it for a couple minutes and then reapplied it over. So this is actually 2 layers, so you can just take that for what it's worth. Overall, it looks to be a fine ink. I'm thinking that most of its problems was because I've had this probably for over a decade. I've had it for a long time. So that's the Higgins calligraphy ink. Now this ink, again, it didn't perform well the first time. I double swatched it. That put it into the contention of being a fairly black ink. So on the Bristol, it performed better with 3.6%. And then on the hot press watercolor paper, is at 4.8%. The surface quality is kind of irregular. It probably is a little bit more matte for the most part than some of the other inks we were looking at, especially the acrylic-based inks, although there is a sheen to it. And then this one kind of ended up being fairly irregular. It may have been my application, but you can see that it ended up, but you can see how flat I have to get that sheen off this. So it's definitely somewhat of a matte ink. It did not apply well. The numbers are good. It's relatively neutral, and it's relatively waterproof. So this might be an ink. I've never put this into a fountain pen, but I was kind of surprised to see that they claimed it could be put into a fountain pen. So on these cards where I put an X, meant I had some problems. The last one, you'll note that I had an X on it, and I definitely had some problems with it. But this is the Winsor Newton non-waterproof inks. I tend to like non-waterproof inks for some of the things that I do and the way I draw and so forth. This one I had never tried before, and I actually had to go down and buy this bottle. So it was a new bottle of ink, but like the last one, when I applied it, it did not apply well the first time around. And this was the one I really kind of went through my process of, do I re-swatch it? Do I do it? So I noticed that there was a little bit of grit in the bottom when I dumped this out and then put it back in the bottle. So I ended up shaking it for quite a while, and I reapplied it. So again, this is two layers of ink. So note that in this discussion. Once it was applied the second time, I can't honestly say if me shaking it for like a couple of minutes improved it, or it just is improved because it had 2 layers. Keep also in mind that I noticed that some of these inks did not perform terribly well with this thick brush nib. So it could be a brush nib, it could be the paper surface. It doesn't mean it's necessarily a bad ink. It's very matte, and it didn't perform great. This is kind of the fall off where it's now not as dark as my Epson printer. So on the Bristol, it did a little better at 6.9%. And then on the, I have these backwards. So on the bristle, it actually performed better on the hot press watercolor paper at 6.9 and 7.2 on the Bristol. That's such a small variation. That's probably just, goes away. And it is slightly warm, about 0.5% difference in tonality between the warm tones and the blue. So there's just a slight bit of warmth to it. You can maybe see it a little bit. After 2 layers, it was fairly opaque, but I still see places where it wasn't. It has a nice level of not waterproofness. Now, a couple things is we'll be showing different levels of this. The Lamy ink is very not waterproof. It flows almost too easily. When I'm using a non-waterproof ink, I like it to flow, but I like it to take a little work to make it flow so it just doesn't grab and go. This had that kind of quality. You can see that on the Bristol here, it flowed a little bit better than it did on the watercolor paper. Perhaps I didn't work that in as much, but you can see the line here is a little lighter, so it lifted that. I tend to like my line work to stay down and then it flow so you can still see that line work. So it's kind of this interesting thing with non-waterproof inks. You have to decide how much you want to be able to pick it up. Some inks you can pick it up completely so you don't see your line work. Some you can create a nice gray from it, but it still leaves your line work. I'll show an example of that was actually using the Higgins non-waterproof ink. So overall, I'm having a hard time recommending this, but I'll take it that maybe something just didn't go right. Winsor Newton typically makes good inks. This is a very matte finished ink, although there's a little bit of bronzing. You can see it through here where there was different amounts of ink on it. You can also see it in the lines between the strokes of the pen. That bronzing might not be appealing, and I don't know how you might control that. And it did the same on the Bristol paper, so a little bit of bronze. So it wasn't this beautiful matte surface. Possibly if it was applied with a brush, you might get that. But overall, this is a decent ink. I've used the Higgins in the past. It also performed only marginally on these papers, so we'll get to that in a minute. So the next ink we're looking at is another Winsor Newton ink. This one is the waterproof indie ink. So most indie inks traditionally used a shellac binder, but there's a large variety of binders now in indie inks that typically make them waterproof and hold them down, and that's why you don't want to put them into a fountain pen. This ink is a pretty nice ink. It performed better than the non-waterproof right out of the bottle. I've had this a little while. It is definitely more opaque on the Bristol than it is on the hot press watercolor paper. The numbers came in on the Bristol, it was around 4.5%, and then on the hot press water paper, it was around 7%. So, and that's probably due to the opacity of the ink itself. It's very waterproof. You can see it there. Barely, you can just see a little bit of a mark, so maybe a little bit of pickup. This is another ink that was very neutral. The surface quality is really nice. It's a ever so slightly semi-matte, and it handled the pen very well, applied generally very well. Definitely, this is the Bristol, and it applied better on the Bristol. But it's a fairly nice surface quality. I like it a lot. The next ink that I have for you is kind of a wild card. Debbie told me I should try this, and we had a bottle back in our art supplies. It is the Handy Arts Black Velvet Waterproof Indie ink. So Handy Arts Black Velvet Waterproof Indie ink. Handy Arts is a company that mainly sells for educational, so sells into schools for students and so forth. I ended up trying this. This stuff is really inexpensive. I saw it for as low as $1 an ounce. So you can get something like this, which is a 4-ounce bottle, somewhere between $4 and $9 in different places. So it's very inexpensive. And it surprised me that it performed very well. It did perform better on the Bristol with a 6.2% black, and it's slightly on the warm side. It wasn't completely opaque on the hot press watercolor paper. Now you'll notice some of these inks seem to struggle with it, and I think it's the difference in the surface quality. I found this kind of interesting because The hot press watercolor paper is sized for liquids and the Bristol in theory is not. Yet I found more often than not, with a few exceptions, that these inks sat better on top of the Bristol than the hot press watercolor paper. And I'm thinking the Bristol's smoothness is what allowed it to do that, opposed to the hot press watercolor paper, which still has a little bit of slight vellum surface. So this ink again was very black in the 6 to 7% range. It's neutral, very slight warm. It was very waterproof. It didn't pull hardly at all. I can just see a little bit of a shadow on that one. Could have been the brush, so light. Very opaque, and has a nice matte finish. This one, again, is another one that probably really did the finish about as good as any of the other ones. And again, it's cheap, so keep that in mind. So it handled the large brush nib, but overall, I think it's for $1 an ounce, a good value. The next ink is another Dr. P.H. Martin's. It is in the Black Star line of waterproof indie inks, and it is their matte finish ink. And this is another one that I think visually kind of grabbed me as I put it down. It performed better on the Bristol, although it ended up being a little bit darker on the hot press watercolor paper. Overall, it was very waterproof. It is a little bit on the warm side, had a really nice finish on the Bristol. I think it basically handled the Bristol. And again, visually, I thought this was a really good one, even though it didn't perform as good as some of the other ones as far as dark, but it's probably the consistency of the surface quality that really got me. And that may differ for different papers or different ways that you apply it. So the black ended up being somewhere in the 7.9, 7.8 range, pretty black, neutral warm. It is very waterproof, and then the finish is just another place that both the Dr. P.H. Martin's inks I thought did really well. Very consistent, very pleasing, maybe not a complete matte finish, but semi-matte, or maybe you would call it a semi-gloss, but it definitely performed really well for the surface quality. So I was kind of talking about different inks and what you get out of them and the value of that. And this ink is the Higgins non-waterproof indie ink. Looks like this. And they might be changing this bottle too. So this is the old bottle that used to come in a box. And now I notice they're selling it that looks a little bit more like this, like the Black Magic bottle. And it wasn't in a box. So you might be looking more for that one than this one. And the only way you can tell is up here. It's almost a smudge. It's almost impossible to read, but it says non-waterproof. The outer box said non-waterproof, but it would get lost very easily. This is an ink that I've used a fair amount, and I like it, although it did not end up performing well in these two papers. I'll show you a picture of this, of something I've done, and I'll do this. It did do better on the Bristol. Didn't flow off that nib well. So part of it is it didn't interact with that nib well. One reason I like this ink, as I was kind of describing, of how much non-waterproof I like when I'm using a non-waterproof ink. And you can see on both of these papers, it pulls very nice and creates a nice consistent gray, but it leaves the marks for the most part. And that's kind of what I like about it. It tends to work with the way when I use non-waterproof. It's controllable, and it leaves the base mark. So you can get things where you might cross-hatch and then pull it with that, and you'll still see your cross-hatching work, except you'll be applying a gray. So this is an ink, despite its performances, I probably will continue to use. Its black was decent. It came in with moderately opaque and black, so 5.2 on the Bristol and 8 on the watercolor paper. As you can see, even where it's pretty dense, it is not a typically dark black. And I can't really explain it. It is slightly warm in tone, and it's very, it has as some of the ones I've been showing recently here now, it does have a little bit of a sheen, and then you can see areas where there's some interesting changes in the, depending on how thick the ink was applied and whether you hit it with water. This one on the watercolor paper, as you can see, it's not totally opaque, And it has a interesting bronzing that happened where the ink was thicker. It also works on sketch papers and things like that. So this is another ink that I like. Did not perform terribly well, but it's characteristics that I tend to like to do sometimes. I don't do it all the time, but sometimes. Although I am going to probably want to try I think the Winsor Newton performed a little bit better, even though I had problems with it. So I might do some testing between the two and see which one I tend to like for this. The next ink here is Blackest Black. This is supposed to be the world's blackest matte ink, or that's how they sold it. It claims to be bleed proof, waterproof, drip proof, mega matte, and stupidly black. This came out several years ago when several companies were trying to make the blackest paints and inks and so forth. An artist, Anish Kapoor, who acquired the exclusive artistic rights to the Vanta Black, which they claimed was the blackest black ever, was a big into the news. And so another group called Culture Hustle then came out with the Blink Black, which they claimed was the blackest black. Well, I honestly, now the other one I can't get because it's proprietary, but this one I ended up buying, and I didn't really find it terribly impressive, as you can see where it is in my little thing here. So the black numbers here are 8.3 and 8.5. It's fairly neutral with a little bit of a warm tone to it. It has a decent matte finish to it, but I don't think it's anything exceptional. I believe it performed a little bit better on the Bristol, but you can see, as with a lot of these, it does have a bit of a sheen to it. When you're looking straight at it, it's pretty black, and it has a nice matte finish. So overall, it performed adequately. It wasn't terribly opaque on the hot press watercolor paper. You can see in different spots here where they it could be the way it performed with the nib or so forth, but keep that consistent opaqueness. It took a little bit of effort on this, and you can see how the surface quality kind of, depending on how thick the ink was. It's not a bad ink. I can't remember the price. I think it's a little bit pricey, but honestly, I think you can get better inks. And the last one here is going to be FW Black, which I've used quite a bit. And this is another ink that I like. It's an acrylic-based black ink. But I think one of the challenges with all of these is you get a surface quality that's, a little bit more glossy than the other inks. And this one did not perform on these papers terribly well. As you can see from a waterproofness, it pulled just ever so slightly, which is not enough to really concern me. It's just the black level. So on the Bristol, it was 7.2, and then on the watercolor paper it was 8.5, which just doesn't put it in the running as the blackest of blacks. Where it does shine is it applied fairly well. It is a little bit on the thicker side, so you can see on the watercolor paper, there's not a whole lot of pen mark to it. There's a little bit more on the Bristol where you can see the overlaps in the surface quality, and that is apparent even when you look down at it. But it is still a decent ink, and this is actually the last ink in this category that I'm testing, with one exception. I have one more, but it's a slightly different ink. I put it in this category, but it's a little different. Anyway, this came in. This is a slightly warm ink too. It's about half a percent on the warm side, and overall, though, it performs well with dip pens and so forth. So it's a decent ink also. I didn't really review anything that was totally crappy. Most of these inks I own, so there you are. The last ink is another ink that came out of the De La Rowney booth from the big trade show. It is the De La Rowney's Aquafine watercolor ink. Now this one got a little bit messed up, but it still worked, the outside. This is actually a watercolor. That's why I wanted to separate it out Generally, watercolors are considered to be a little transparent, and that's the goal. As you add water to them, they become transparent. This was actually quite opaque regardless, but it's quite a bit different from the other inks we were looking at because it's classified as a watercolor. I thought it actually performed, even though it wasn't like any of the other paints and probably should have been a little harder. It definitely worked better on the Bristol than it did on the hot press. It came in at a very black 1.1 and 1.4, so it's down well below the paint sample. It is on the warm side, almost a percent toward the warm side, a little bit more on the Bristol, and it pulls very nicely. Within what I kind of described as I like to keep my line quality, it pulled the lines up a little bit, but it was very controllable in the way that the watercolor ended up moving when I hit it with water. And then the surface quality of it is actually quite appealing. It has a very slight sheen to it, and it held some of the characteristics of seeing where it might have been applied just a little bit thicker. Again, I kind of felt like it performed a little bit better on the Bristol, although it was a little bit more consistent on the watercolor paper. So and of course, watercolor and watercolor paper sounds like a good matchup, right? This is an interesting ink you might want to consider for some projects. It would pull it fairly easy, but I found it to be pretty nice, and I imagine if you're working with watercolors, or this line has a full range of colors. As I should mention, the FW has a full range of colors, and the System 3 and the Golden High Flow all have a full range of colors that you can use. This I was mainly working with blacks on this. So that's the range of dip, pen, brush, or airbrush types inks that I'm reviewing in that. Again, I think when you look at these from the perspective of what is the best ink, some of it is going to be the surface quality, which might be depending on what paper you're going to put it on. Okay, so our next section is fountain pen inks. Typically, fountain pen inks are the only kind of ink you want to put into a fountain pen because they're designed to flow through the fountain pen, not clog and not dry and mess up your fountain pen. I know I say that regularly in these kind of videos, but it's really important to note. The other thing about fountain pen ink, for the most part, is it's a thinner ink than the inks that we've been using, especially like the paint-based inks. And so, as a result, they don't often have the opacity in the way that I applied them that you would see in some of the other inks that I have shown you. So keeping that in mind, the first ink, and the one that really performed the best from a blackness scale, is one that I picked up at the trade show I just went through, and it's by a company, Platinum. Platinum is a 104-year-old company, and this is their blackest ink they've ever made, according to their ad material. It's the Kuro, which apparently means very black in Japanese. You can tell me in the comments if I'm wrong, but that's what I was led to believe. And it is a pigment-based, water-resistant fountain pen ink. One of my favorites from the Platinum is the Carbon Black, which is also in this test, and we're going to talk about that one. So this one's kind of got the industry in a little bit of an uproar. A lot of people are talking about it. One thing to note is this is very expensive. This is a $60 bottle of ink, so not cheap. But fountain pen, this is 60 milliliters, so $1 a milliliter. But that's a lot of ink. It'll last you a while unless you put it on in big swatches like I just did. And it comes with a really nice box. So it's kind of good. But the thing about this ink that it really kind of surprised me, because it went on very opaquely. It has a wonderful finish. It may be one of the best finishes of the inks that we've tested so far. You can see that this one is just super, super consistent. It just has a slight sheen, maybe just ever so slightly more sheen than the paper itself. This is the Bristol. You can see a little bit where it has the lines from that. You can see this where I hit it with the water. It wasn't terribly waterproof, but a lot of fountain pen inks aren't and take some time to get to that waterproof level. I believe the Platinum fountain pen ink performed maybe ever so slightly better, but for the most part, for a fountain pen ink, it's considered waterproof. There's not a lot of them. The one fountain pen ink that I'm aware of that is also waterproof that did not get in this mix just because I didn't have a bottle readily available is the Super 5 Black waterproof fountain pen ink, which it should be pretty good also. I just didn't have any of it. So again, a couple things this kind of scored on the Bristol 4.1 and on the watercolor paper 4.6. I think the Bristol handled it just a little bit better, but still it's right at the level of the printer as far as creating a black. Very nice surface quality. It's also pretty neutral, so it's a fairly neutral in color. So all around, it's a really good ink. Okay, the application was really good. There are a couple caveats though. One is, again, the price. It's fairly expensive. It's fairly new. You might find it a little harder to buy in your pen store, but it should be getting out in the market. It's distributed in the United States from Luxury Brands, and it should be anywhere you can get Platinum pens. I am not aware that Platinum is putting this in cartridge. The other downside of this ink that you should be aware of, and I don't honestly know, I have not put this in a fountain pen yet, so I haven't tested it at that level. I did this all with the dip pen. And the downside is they claim that you only want to wash this ink with distilled water. So not a big, I bought a big thing of it for a couple bucks from the store, so that's not a big deal. It's just you need to be aware of it. Apparently, the fineness of the pigment interacting with the solids in the water can create problems, causing your fountain pen to clog or various other things. So distilled water only. At some point soon, I'll probably be putting this in a fountain pen and doing a drawing with it. It is noticeably blacker than the other inks that I've used so far, so it's pretty exciting. I think it's going to be a good ink if you like to draw and so forth. Again, the surface quality is amazing. You could use this with a brush and other things. Something I would check out if you can afford it. It is expensive. So Noodler's Black was my first love in fountain pen inks. It is a semi-waterproof fountain pen ink depending on the paper you put it on. It was always my understanding that it performed better on alpha cellulose or wood pulp based papers over cotton papers. This test did not show that that was the case. And it has a really wonderful matte black finish. Now in the applications with the dip pen that I used, it did not flow as opaquely as the other platinum ink there. You get a big bottle, it's fairly affordable. This is generally about $15 and it is 3 ounces. So it's a big bottle, a lot of ink. It's very black. It's pretty matte finish, which I like a lot. In the blackness, on the Bristol, it was 4.1, and on the watercolor, it was 5.9. I think its score suffered a little because of opaqueness off the nib and onto the surface quality of the paper itself. You may be able to get a better coverage and get a blacker. I have drawings with this that I like a lot. It's definitely one of my go-to inks, or at least it was until I started using the platinum carbon ink, which we're going to talk about in just a moment. One downside of this ink is that it tends to be a little finicky in the pen. I don't like to leave it in a pen for more than a week or so, so you definitely have to clean the pen out. And all around, the use of it is a little bit harder than I found the platinum carbon black, and that one has another advantage I'll talk about in a second. But you can see here that it has a fairly matte finish. It will create a certain sheen, but it's not terribly more than the paper itself. It's pretty black. It did hold some of the lines. There's some ever so slightly bronzing depending on the thickness of the ink on the paper. On the watercolor paper, it performed not quite as well, so this might not be a good surface for it. You can see there's definitely some bronzing in certain areas. In these areas here, it actually is a little less opaque, so this might not be the best paper for it, but it's a really good ink. You can use it with a brush also, dip pen and so forth. Our next ink is another pigment-based ink by Platinum. It's called the Platinum Carbon ink, and it comes like this. This is 60 milliliters, kind of like the Chou Kuro. So it's a lot of ink. It's definitely more affordable than the Chou Kuro, and it's pretty much my go-to ink. It didn't perform stunningly on this test, but it's fairly waterproof, as you can see. I think it's the most waterproof out of the 3 inks that I've shown you so far. The surface quality in it didn't apply terribly well with this particular paper or with the nib that I used. I think you can see in the writing and the lines that it actually performs better than the actual swatches. The surface quality has somewhat of a matte finish, but it definitely has a bit of a gloss when you put it on in this way. And so in both cases, I wasn't terribly happy with that. But I can say with drawing with it that I actually find this to be a fairly good ink. It only scored 5.6% on the Bristol, a little bit better, and then not well at all on the hot press watercolor paper at 8.5%. It tended toward the green just a little bit, and its opacity in both cases wasn't stunning. But one reason I like this, and I'll probably continue to use this ink, is because it is fairly waterproof and Platinum sells it in cartridges. And so this is a 4 cartridge pack, and the cartridges look something like this. And then this is the pack that you would get, and it's a really it's a good ink considering you can get in that. And then the final kicker for this is that these cartridges fit into Platinum Preppy fountain pens, which is pretty much a $7. I've seen these anywhere from $5 up to like $8 or $9, and then you can sometimes get patterns on them and colors. Like this one's in color. Most of mine are the demonstrator, the clear. And they have a really decent nib. You can get these nibs in this is a 0.3, but they have a 0.2, 0.3, and a 0.5. It's extra fine, fine, and medium, and it's a Japanese-based pen. So those pen nibs tend to be one size smaller than German. I typically like to draw with the O2, the Preppy O2 with this carbon black ink in it is really a combination that's great. The other thing that I noticed about these, not to be pitching pens right now, but they travel well too. I've flown with them and so forth. So this combination is the reason I'm going to continue using this ink. It actually is a pretty decent fountain pen ink despite the test here. Again, that new Platinum Chou Kuro is definitely what I'm going to be trying. It definitely outperforms this. Between this and the Noodlers is kind of an interesting thing because I have definitely gone back and forth between these 2 inks. The Noodlers is more matte finish and I think a little bit darker. The tests definitely show that it's a little bit darker, but it's a little bit more problematic. It's you don't want to leave it in your pen for as long. Its pigments tend to clog pens a little bit more and come out of most pens less consistently than I have found with the carbon black. I do go to this ink from time because I do like that luscious matte finish and the depth of its black. But in all honesty, I draw a lot more with the carbon black, the Platinum, because of the cartridges and those preppy pens. They're just very convenient. So that is those 2. I highly recommend both of them depending on the situation. So the final ink we're going to be dealing with here is going to be the Lamy Black ink. And it looks like something like this little bottle here. I think this too is a, what is it? This is a 30 milliliter bottle. So it has a fair amount of ink also. And the one difference between this is this ink is not trying to be waterproof. It is a dye-based ink, unlike the other 3. All 3 of the previous inks were pigment-based, attempting to be somewhat waterproof. This is a dye-based ink, and it flows very readily if hit with water. It is a little bit fun, but it almost flows too well. You can see over here how it flowed completely, and over here, and you can often bring your line work almost completely up with water. It is decently matte black. It didn't score fantastic. So on the Bristol, I got it backwards initially, but on the Bristol, 6.9% black, and then on the watercolor paper, the hot press, it's 9.1%. It's relatively neutral with a tendency to go toward red. And then the surface quality has a little bit of bronzing to it. Let's see if I can get it. There we are. So there's a little bit of a sheen or a bronzing that kind of happened. You can see it through here, and you can definitely see where the different thicknesses were of the watercolor paper. This is the Bristol. Again, a fair amount of bronzing and so forth. That's only really a problem in its application. Visually, when you're looking down, as you would from this camera here, you see that it is pretty black and decent. I think it performed better on the Bristol. Now, another interesting thing is it looks a little red to the camera here, but you can see that obviously you get some other colors. The fun thing about this ink is when you do hit it with water, it does break out into other colors, and you can see how it will kind of come out. And so it is fun to do a drawing with and then pull it with a water pen or a wet brush. The Higgins non-waterproof dip pen ink that I was talking about earlier held its line better and pulled with a little bit more difficulty, which made it a little bit more predictable. This stuff flows like crazy, so this takes a little bit of practice to do it with, but it is a fun thing to do. And that's where we're at on fountain pen inks. I don't have a ton of them. There are a lot of fountain pen inks out there, though. I will tell you that. Okay, so the final section is ink in pens. And so I have a range of pens that we tested here. Now, the thing to note, I found this kind of interesting, and we're going to do a little test at the end, is none of these pens performed anywhere near as good as the previous two sections on these particular papers. And I don't know, it could be the paper quality, it could be that I try to do too large of a swatch. There is a thing, all of these inks that are in pens have a different way of feeding the ink in through sometimes some kind of feed mechanism to the nib itself, and they have a capacity to supply a certain amount of ink at a certain rate for a certain amount of time, and once that exhausts, the pen will slow down and begin to kind of act like it's drying up, and sometimes you just need to stop for a minute and let the pen catch up with you. And so doing such a large section might be one of my problems. What I ended up doing with all of these, as you can see with this particular swatch here, is I ended up doing an overlap. So created two kinds of layers to get it to work, because I figure a lot of times you'd probably be doing something like that. If you're trying to get a large dark area, you'd probably overlap it a little bit. In some cases that worked and not. I am going to attempt to take several of these and put them onto another paper that I have over here, which is a mixed media paper. Now again, the Arches hot press is a sized paper, so I kind of expected it to kind of hold the ink a little bit more on the surface, but as a whole, again, I found like a lot of cases that the Bristol actually outperformed the watercolor paper in some of these situations, although different anomalies kind of came up in different ways. With all that said, we're going to kind of go on, and I mainly use these secondary sections that you're going to see in all of them where I doubled this up. A pen that I'm going to start off with is one of my favorites, is the Pentel Arts Pocket Brush Pen. It is a permanent pigment-based ink that's waterproof. On most of the applications, I've always been pretty happy with it. It has a decent flow and it creates a pretty black finish. In comparison to what I've been showing you, this is not very black, and you'll see this by the numbers, but the pen looks like this. It can be a little bit on the pricey side. I've seen it anywhere from $10 to $20. It has a true brush tip to it, so it is a nylon-based brush, not a felt tip. Some of these other ones have felt tips. And I've always gotten a really black line. You can make some pretty thin lines. You get really expressive lines out of it. It is a fun pen. So its scores were between 6.5 and 7.4 on the hot press, so it performed a little bit better on the Bristol. Although one thing to note is as I pulled this across, it had a tendency to irregularly feed the ink onto the paper. It may be that the smooth is just too smooth, and I've noticed that on several of these pens. So sometimes a very smooth paper can interact with a pen in a way that you don't really want. A certain amount of tooth to the paper will kind of cause the pen to flow a little bit smoother, and in this case we can see that. The other thing is in the second layer is much smoother on the hot press with a little bit more tooth than it is on the Bristol. You can kind of see really drastic overlapping lines there, and you can again see that a little bit more in the secondary swatch. For the most part, it's slightly warm in nature, and then it's pretty matte finish, although you can see a little bit the swatch, the secondary swatch is more shiny than just a single layer as on both of these papers. And that's kind of true with all the ones that I tested, is the second layer kind of ended up being a little bit more shiny, but you really have to get at a really specific angle to see that shine. So it isn't a deal breaker in my opinion. Again, this not only performed as one of the best pens that I tried, it's one of my favorites, although it does take time to learn these pens. They're not something you're just going to pick up and do really well with, in my humble opinion. And as I said, we're going to try to do some additional tests on this. The next pen we're going to look at here is a Faber Castell Pitt pen. Now, Faber Castell puts their pigment-based ink into a lot of their pens, and I just chose this one here. It's a dual-ended marker type. I liked it because it has a pretty nice brush on one end, and then on the other end it has a little bit of a fine point or bullet point. And so you can see those. I use those for the thickness and the thin here. Actually I used an FM brush, another a Fude nib for the thinner line there, which is the same ink. These inks performed decent on the Bristol 4.9, which is decent. Again, that's on the double overlapping section, and then 8 on the watercolor paper. Again, that additional tooth is probably causing these to be a little less dark, because it's probably soaking that ink in just a little into the paper. You can see though on the single pass here, it was darker on the Bristol also. So it performed better. It's pretty waterproof. On the Bristol, it was a little less waterproof, able to pull up some of the color as you can see here, and it pulled out, and it did not happen on the watercolor paper, surprisingly. And then the surface quality is a really nice. Again, it's the same kind of thing. You ended up seeing more sheen if I doubled up the ink, but neither of these was terrible. And for the most part, it was a pretty flat ink and almost the same sheen as the paper itself. And if I didn't say it, it's slightly warm ink tone, almost 1%. Well, actually, it's 0.4 on the watercolor paper, 0.8 difference on the Bristol. Our next pen is a pen that I also tend to like. I think a lot of the fine liners that I've been trying are very similar, although the Pointliner definitely kind of stands out in my mind as working pretty well and having a pretty rugged nib. The feed on these, again, it didn't perform well. Now, on some of these, I didn't have a very fat pen, so I was trying to make large swatches with a fairly thin pen nibs. I think this one had a 1.2 or something that I was applying this with, and had gaps, and you can see where it doubled up, and then these swatches are doubled, and that's where I took my readings from for the most part. I do have the one-sided readings, but it didn't perform terribly well. Same thing, I think there's a bit of problem here with the paper not being ideal for the pen, and again, we're going to test this one on the other ones also. But Where the doubled up, the black is 9.8 on the Bristol, and we have it at 8.4 on the watercolor paper. So it ended up being a little bit blacker, but you can see more differences. This ended up being a more consistent black. And this one had a really good surface. Even the doubled up really was consistent with the other. So the surface quality of this is quite nice. Not too much more shine than I would see from the paper itself. So really nice results from that perspective, just not quite as black as I was hoping for. Then we get into the Microns. The Microns have the advantage of having the most different sizes of pens. So they have a brush pen. So I actually ended up doing this a second time. When I was at the show, my first attempt at this, I kind of felt like my brush pen that I used for the swatch was a little, maybe not at its peak. I'd used it a few times and I had it for a little while. The new pen only performed marginally better than my old pen. But when I was at the trade show, they had given me a few of these brush pens for this test. And then they told me about the Pigma Pro brush pens, which is these. And I'd kind of forgotten they existed, to be honest. And they have 3 different sizes. So that's the medium tip. And then they have a fine tip. It looks like that. And then they have a broad tip, which looks like this. So again, I kind of forgot that these existed. And so I decided to swatch both the brush nib and then the larger brush nib from the Pro line. And you can see there's a little difference. The ink in theory is the same, but it's a little darker down here, and I would probably argue that has to do with the feed. They might have a better feed in the Pro nib than they do in the standard Microns. And so I ended up testing all of these. So the standard Micron brush tip pen on the 2-pass ended up with a black of 13.8 on the watercolor paper and 9 on the Bristol, which is kind of in the average. When you get down to the Pro one, it went to, the Bristol was 14.1 and the Bristol was 11.5 and the watercolor is 14.1. So what's interesting here is for some reason, so all around, these typically work better than they're showing here in my humble opinion. Again, I'm going to try them on another paper. They're waterproof, as with all of these have been very waterproof. You can just barely see that it pulled up just ever so slightly. These pens had some of that irregularity in how they were applied in different areas, more on the Bristol, but I can see it a little here on the watercolor. The one thing about the Sakura Pigma Micron is that they have the most number of nibs, and they also have quite a few colors that you can get in different sizes. So they have a really broad range of pens that are available, and yeah, so they're a good option. The next one we're looking at here is the Tombow dual-ended water-based brush pen. This has a dye-based ink in it. So this dual-ended has a brush nib on one end, and then has a finer point kind of felt tip nib on the other end. And this one performed pretty decently. It tended toward the blue just ever so slightly, but it was on the watercolor paper, it ended up on the double layer at 8.5%. And then on the Bristol, it ended up 6.4. So those are pretty decent numbers for that. They're not super, super opaque, but the black is pretty decent. There's a little bit of sheen or bronzing that occurs that may not be easy to pick up, which shows that it's not that much. So in these double color areas, that it tends to bronze a little bit more than you might see. Again, that is mainly visible when you're looking at these severe angles. When you're looking directly down at them, like you do from this camera, you really you don't see that very much. These, because they're dye-based, do pull very well. They do break out in some different colors. You can see that it can almost pull up the line work completely with water. It should be noted that Tombow has a blender marker also. I don't know what magic is in it. I don't know if it's just water, if there's another agent that increases the amount it will pull. I found variations of how much it will pull. Depends on the paper and various things like that. But it is a fairly fun, easy. The nice thing about water-based markers opposed to like alcohol markers is they don't go through most papers. One other one I threw in is the Edding 1880. I had a friend who liked this pen a lot, and I bought a small set, and they do seem to be pretty decent. I only had small nibs, so it was really hard to do this test with this. A couple things I didn't like on these papers. It did end up being quite black, even the first pass. Now, one thing, it might not be fair because I had just a small nib pen and I kind of went over, so it's probably unlikely that I created a single layer in any one spot. So where I did it twice isn't too much different from where I did it on one pass as far as the darkness, but I did still do it off here. One thing to note, and I don't know if you'll be able to see it, is that in the place that I did it in 2 passes, it felt like the pen was kind of pulling the ink up again on the second pass, so it was kind of an irregular surface. It wasn't terribly desirable, to be honest. And the same thing happened on the Bristol, and I don't know how easily you can see that. There is a little bit of a sheen. Okay, so the 2 pass on the hot press watercolor paper was 11.3%, and it's 6%, which is pretty good on the Bristol. So it's the Edding 1880 Drawliners. They did okay. I'm not aware of how many nibs they have. This is a line that's fairly new to the United States. Again, I had an artist friend who liked them, and that's what encouraged me to get them. And they do work pretty well. I don't know how much better they work from the Sakura or the Pointliners. I tend to have been using the Pointliners a lot more recently than I have in the past, and they just seem to be my go-to, although I have not done, this is the first testing I've done, and I'm not sure my differences have been too well solved between these. They all perform very well. This may have a slight edge from the blackness, especially on these papers. And then a pen that came out just a few years ago by Faber Castell is their Faber Castell Goldfaber Aqua. And this is a direct competitor to the Tombow. It's a water-based, dye-based ink. And so in both of these cases, those kind of inks tend to not have fantastic light fastness, you should be aware of, but a very similar brush pen on one side. And this one has a little bit more of a fine tip. I kind of like this tip a little bit better. It's because the much more difference between the other one. The Tombow had a little bit more of a bullet point tip than that little fine point tip. And as you can see here, this one performed decently with the black on the Bristol. Performed best here at 6.9, and then on the watercolor paper it was 9%. So this is a pretty good performing pen, and I think it outperformed the Tombow in some of the things. So you can see the hot press here. Well, I think they're very similar, actually. I think that that's darker than that. This one's very similar. That one's fairly consistent. This is more consistent over here. So again, depending on the paper, surface and paper makes a huge difference. The Tombow ended up being, on the watercolor paper, pretty neutral, although it has a tendency to look a little bit blue. The Faber-Castell Goldfaber Aquas came in, as I said, 6.9 and 9. They were a little bit on the warm side at 0.9 and 1.4% from a warmth or neutrality. And on the Bristol, you can see here that it suffered from that inconsistency as I drew the lines across on this very smooth paper. So it didn't do that on the watercolor paper. I think from a single pass perspective, this is a little bit better than the Tombows were. So pretty good pen. Again, you get all the advantages. Water-based, it's not going to soak through. Not terribly light fast would be the downfall of this. And it creates, if you double layer it, creates a pretty nice dark. Then one that I threw in that's kind of an interesting is another Tombow pen, and they're a pen that I like a lot, and again, that I feel like it performs better on other papers I've used them, is the Tombow Fudesako brush pens. And these are interesting pen. They have a soft and a hard nib, and they're rubber tips. They look like that. And what's kind of nice, you get a really good feedback from them, and you get a decent flow with them, and you can get a lot of line variation, which makes them really fun to use. They did not perform exceptionally well on these papers. So on the Bristol, I got a 6.9 on the double layer, although if you can see this, the double layer kind of, again, did that thing where it kind of pulled the ink up a little bit, so you ended up with a slightly irregular surface, if I can get the light on it right. So I wasn't really happy with the double layer, at least on this. It didn't perform quite as well as I like. On the watercolor paper, although, it did perform a little bit better, creating a nicer surface that didn't kind of get disrupted by doing the double layer. And they both came out kind of black and double layer, but trying to create one big area of tone with a single layer was challenging, hard, and didn't work very well. And you can kind of see that the feed rates of the pen kind of suffered. Like for here, you can kind of see on this side, it's darker and lightens as I pull it across, darker and lightens. So the feed rate on these may not be really good for fast trying to draw in a big dark area. I still find these a really great and fun pen to use. So this test aside, this is where the pen and the nib kind of maybe outweigh the ink itself or the flow. And the final pens in this test are going to be a pen that I got at the show. Staedtler wanted inclusions, so they gave me these pens. These are the Staedtler Pigment liners. And interesting thing about this is these actually had the best single pass performance of all of these pens. And you can see, especially here, there's very little difference between the 2 layer and the 1 layer. Although on the Bristol, it still suffered a little bit from that pulling up the ink. And you can see it ever so slightly in this area here. And possibly and it has a little bit more sheen in that double area. So I didn't really, I thought that was an interesting thing that kind of happened on this Bristol, mainly between these two pens when I try to go the other way across these dark areas. But all around, for a single layer, these worked the best. Still didn't perform beautifully. So they performed around 20 on the Bristol and 21 on the, I think I have these backwards. Oh, I do. Okay, so it's 17.4 and 17.3. 17.4% on the Bristol and 17.3, so slightly better on the watercolor paper, another slightly unusual thing. And I only had thin pens here, so it was really hard to do anything, so I didn't fill up the whole 3" by 3" place. But these, again, worked. Interesting that their single layer performance was probably the best of all of them. So that is where we're at with this testing. I did want to pull out and do a quick swatch test. So this is a paper that I use pretty consistently. This is a Strathmore Visual Journal Mixed Media, and an interesting thing to note is it is 100% cotton paper. These visual journals have some of their better papers in them, believe it or not, and they have these visual journals in Bristol and watercolor and a few other, draw, I believe, and maybe even a sketch, but they're all high quality papers, somewhere between their 400 and 500 series. The 100% cotton here means that it is generally above the 400 series. But I've usually found that these pens perform pretty well on this paper. And so what I'd like to do is we're going to just test these, and we will start somewhere near the beginning with the pocket brush pen. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to mark these on here, and we'll kind of use these as a guiding line for them to kind of see, but I'm anticipating, could be wrong in this, that these are going to do, oops, flowing real good. Might be almost out of this ink, but we're going to get a little bit as I go down. I'll come back to that when it completely dries. Then the Micron, again, didn't get great performance. This is the brush tip in the normal Microns here, and it would be more like the top part. Kind of realized I didn't apply it quite the same way, but a little darker here than there, but not terribly. And then I also have this guy here, which is the Big and the Pro, which is going to be more like this one. So again, for single layer performance, they're actually surprisingly similar. So I was expecting more difference just from usage kind of thing. As they dry, they're tending to go down a little bit. So we can see pretty rapidly that these pens are performing on this paper not too much different from the other papers that we're using. This is the Pointliner. This has the 3 in this is kind of a chisel tip. Dries, yeah, so these are actually coming out very much similar to they are in this paper. So I guess I got distorted by looking at fountain pen inks and dip pen inks, which definitely perform very well. This might be just slightly different in darkness than I'm getting off of these swatches. So overall, despite this little thing, paper surfaces and so forth make a really large difference. So finding the surface that works with your medium is always going to be a really important thing. So a couple things that I did learn from this test is, one thing, as you go from a dip pen ink to a fountain pen ink to an ink in a pen, you're going to see a degradation in quality. Your dip pen inks are going to be the most opaque, thickest. They don't have the restriction that they have to go and be able to stay in a pen for several years and flow through a feed and into a small nib, not clog, not ever need to be cleaned or things like that. And so the disadvantage is the care and feeding and craft that you have to learn to use a dip pen, a brush, or an airbrush, or technical pen. The advantage is you get a selection of much higher quality, more opaque inks. And so there is definitely an advantage to going with that. Again, surfaces are a big difference. You got a difference between 100% cotton hot press watercolor paper to a Bristol smooth, and then this is a mixed media cotton. And as these dry out, they're a little different than those swatches, but not as substantial as I was thinking they might be. This is the Faber Castell one here, and see, now what I'm doing is a little different, because the way I did these is I did them this way. And there's definitely a difference in application too. But it goes on a little darker and then it kind of goes out. But you can see there's not a ton of difference on those particular papers. But you may find papers where these inks will shine. Pens are more convenient. You don't quite get the quality you're going to get from the other things. And then when you look at some of the fountain pen inks, the biggest difference between the fountain pen inks and the inks probably in these is going to be the feed. A lot of fountain pens tend to flow really well. You can actually get a fair amount of ink coming off the nib, which isn't always true of these fine liners or even some of these brush pens. So harder pens, better inks, pens that are disposable and so forth, you're probably going to get less density to the ink. It doesn't mean that these can't be used to great effect. I still use all these pens. I think they're really great for different applications. And I think when you draw different kinds of drawings, which I'll probably be showing through here, often you won't notice, especially in line work and things like that. The reason this test is so hard to point to one ink and say, yes, that ink performed the best and that's the ink you should use is because of all the dynamics I'm talking about. So, we looked at a lot of surfaces and how much it's reflection or glossiness or matte finish, and if that's important to you, certain inks definitely stood out. They had a better surface quality. Matte finishes make for, a very pleasing look. I tend to like more of a matte finish ink than a glossy ink. And so something like the Golden's High Flow, I think if you're using that with other acrylic inks or paints, that's going to work really nicely because it will fit in with that and it's super black. Whereas if you're working with inks and a lot of the inks are more matte finish, then you're going to be needing an ink that probably has more of a matte finish. How neutral it is. There wasn't a huge variety in the neutrality of the colors. I definitely noticed that the Tombow tended to look more cool, and that was the standout, and maybe inks that weren't quite as neutral as I would have expected. I think that the warmer tones tend to look more natural when you're talking about blacks. So just be aware that some of them did shift a little bit cooler, but for the most part, almost all the other inks, for the most part, the neutrality was actually pretty decent. And then you saw that where probably some of the biggest surface kind of quality is how the pen worked on the particular surface and whether it would go on smoothly as you pulled the pen across. Was getting those variations, and you can kind of see it here, but possibly if you're applying it a little bit more like you might do a brush with a back and forth kind of thing, you may get a little less of that. So application is definitely the kind of thing. I was trying to apply one layer, and so I was kind of drawing these lines across that way, and that may have been what yielded these kind of interesting variations in the way they applied. But combining your inks with your papers are definitely going to be an important thing. So those are my primary takeaways. Okay, so what are the recommendations? And again, I actually felt like overall everything performed pretty well with a few minor exceptions, and I think the exceptions probably were explained by just compatibility with the paper or so forth. But what were the standouts? I have a handful of standouts that I think stood out quite a bit. Of course, the Golden High Flow with its carbon black is super black, and if you don't mind the glossiness to the surface, then this is definitely a good option. I think again it will work better with more acrylic kind of applications rather than maybe full-on ink applications, but darn black stuff. This was one that Dale Rowney gave me at the show, and it's not as glossy as the High Flow, but it still has a little bit of that acrylic glossiness to it. But again, really dark stuff. I thought the System 3 Dale Rowney did exceptionally well, and I'm looking forward to playing with it more. I thought that it tended to have a pretty nice surface that I thought you could get a really consistent surface on. My 3/4 inch pen nib did leave lines in it, but it didn't discourage me from thinking that you could get some really good results, and it was extremely black. Two kind of in the middle, and it mainly I think had some of the best surface quality, was the two Dr. P.H. Martin's inks, both the matte and the HICARB. I thought performed very well. I thought they were a really good ink. I think that the matte finish has a really nice, desirable finish, and then the HICARB, although slightly more glossy, was just slightly darker, and it ended up rating at 4.7% on the darkness scale, where the HICARB was more in the 7s. But both of these inks I thought performed very well, and I like them a lot. And oh, then the one that I just have to say that you should really check out would be this Handy Art, the Black Velvet Waterproof Indie ink. If you want just something just really inexpensive, or you're trying to do very large areas, very impressive ink. I don't think it's quite as good as some of these others, but value, just very inexpensive. If we get into the fountain pen inks, the Chou Kuro is an ink that I would highly recommend trying. With caveat, I have yet to put this into a fountain pen. So the surface quality, especially on that hot press watercolor paper, is just, it's probably the most consistent, darkest combination of inks out there. So even using this with a brush or a dip pen would be good. The two caveats, as I said, $60 a bottle is expensive, and it needs to be cleaned with distilled water. So it may not be for everybody, and I may come back after putting in the fountain pen and giving you slightly other advice, so you've been warned on that. But it looks to be stunning. I still am probably going to end up using my the Carbon Black ink by Platinum a lot, because it comes in cartridges and it's a really good, pretty waterproof. It's more waterproof than the Chou Kuro, so I think this is a good one. I'm still going to use my Noodler's black ink, even though it's a little bit of a pain. And when we get into pens, I still like the Pentel Pocket brush pen. I think that it produces a pretty dark black. It's fun with the brush. It's very expressive lines. It's great to fill in large areas. And I think that this test didn't give it quite what it deserves, even though it's not as black as some of these other inks. It's just accessibility, travelability. It's cartridge based, so you can replace the cartridge in it. And some people even refill this with other inks. I've heard people actually putting the HICARB and the matte Dr. P.H. Martins into it, different ways. I'm not advocating that, but I've heard it's doable. But just the combination of the Pentel ink and this pocket brush pen. The other thing is very durable. So that's a good choice also. And then the standout, I've used a lot of the other Pointliners, and I hadn't used the Staedtler. I've seen a lot of YouTubers use the Staedtler, and they are good. For a single pass, it was the best performing single pass of the inks in pens. So I thought that was good. Doubling it over, going over it, it didn't do really well. I'm going to have to do more testing on that. So all the other Pointliners all perform very well. I'd heard another YouTuber said you just get whatever's on sale, and I can't really argue with that too much. But I think there's something about getting used to an art supply and using it and seeing how it works. But I would recommend maybe checking the Staedtlers. It's the pigment liners. They seem to be really good in that line. Unless you need variety and just can't knock the Sakura, they have just the nib sizes, a huge range of nib sizes, including brush tips and the pro brush tips. And they also have all the colors that are available. One thing that I had shown in a previous video is that they have a set of cool and warm grays that work really well with the blacks, and you can do some really fun stuff. I'll put a picture that I drew with that combination on the screen. And so that's pretty much sums up this mess of pens that I have everywhere, all over the place. I do like working in pen and ink, and I learned a little bit from this, but I also learned that there's not really a standout. There's not one I can point to and say, sell all your pens and buy that one, or sell all your inks and buy that one. There's a range, and most of these did really well. And finally, if you have some recommendations on ink and pens and black ink specifically in pens, put them in the comments below. Let other people know. It helps grow. I'm trying to grow a community here, so check that out and do that. So please leave a comment if you have an opinion. So if you like this kind of content, please give us a thumbs up and a subscribe. Helps us out a lot, and it's free to you. And if you're going to stick around a little while, I'm going to put 2 videos right here and here that you can continue on with. If not, go make some art.